Welcome back. Welcome back from your coffee break. Welcome back from your coffee break, and I'd like to invite you to our next panel, What Europe Needs to Do Now for Its Defense. And we're going to be talking to Kajsa Ollongren, the former defense minister of the Netherlands. Welcome.
Thank you.
And again, I'll try to take a question or two. So if you do use the CDS app to pop in a question, I'll see it pop up on my tablet, and we'll try to address some of those. Big question. Do you think that NATO is dead? In a sense, starting at the top, in a sense, there was NATO had this implicit guarantee that if a member country was attacked, the US cavalry would come charging across the horizon and rescue you. If you're an Estonian or a Lithuanian, I would think that you would have some doubt if that is actually going to happen, and I'm sure the Russians see that as well. Yeah. So what's your take? Like, what is the state of NATO right now?
Well, I think there is reason to worry, and not because NATO is dead, and even not brain dead, as was assumed at some point. I think we in NATO are more united than we were before. I mean, we have two new allies, Sweden and Finland, that entered just because of the Russian threat, and left their long-time policy of neutrality or non-alliance behind them. So NATO is extremely important. And for European security, European defense, that's why we created NATO. But the most important and strongest ally is the United States. And there something has really changed. And there is an unpredictability in the approach of the Trump administration towards Europe and towards NATO that we have to take into account. And that's what has changed. So the Russian threat has not changed, it's still there. The instability in the world has increased, but the uncertainty has also increased. And that means that if I were in one of the Baltic countries or any country on the eastern flank of NATO, I would be extremely worried. And I think it's important in this debate, we often try to simplify it to, we just have to increase our defense spending. So if the other 31 allies do enough, spend 3, 4 or 5% on defense and step up their game, then we'll be fine. But I'm not so sure about that, because let's remember that we had a target, and that target was 2% in 2024. We all agreed to it. And we were not there yet. So I don't buy this story about, we didn't do enough, we always waited for the Americans to come to our rescue. No, we were on a path to do more. Not enough, I agree, but we were on that path to do more. And the only time that Article 5 has actually been invoked was 9/11. And we stepped up. We were there as partner and allies. And that's where we need to be again, that we can rely on the United States. Of course, while doing more, and I think there should be a burden shifting inside NATO, that the European countries and Canada must increase their capabilities and their possibilities and take over from the United States, but we must have this 100% reliance on what is going to remain the biggest and most powerful country within NATO.
Because there's the sense that if you talk to people in the European defense area, that if Trump has mentioned the 5% as a potential target, Mark Rutte has talked about well north of 3% that'll be discussed at the summit in The Hague, that this is sort of the entry ticket for staying in America's good graces. Trump himself has said that he would have doubts about defending a country that didn't spend as much as he thinks is appropriate. But is that unreliability that you mentioned mean that even if you reach those spending targets, you still really can't count on the Americans, and that Europe needs to do much more on its own?
Well, the point is the unpredictability. I like to think that if we agree on a new target at the summit in 6 weeks' time, that will also mean that the Americans will reassure us on that point. But I think that the whole approach, the American approach, is The one week it's this and the next week it's something else. And that's what worries me. So I do think it's very important to, at the summit, have this new target, have all NATO allies agree on this new target. And I think that the SecGen, Mark Rutte, is taking the right approach. Already floating, the idea of let's have 3.5 on hard defense spending. Let's look on other spending like military mobility infrastructure, space assets, things like that, things that you also need for your security to reach the 5%. I think on the European Union side, we're doing the right thing by creating the fiscal space for countries to make these investments. So I think the summit could be a success, and I think it's also a necessary step to reach that budget. But then still, we don't have a plan for if the US wants to pull back its rotational troops, for instance, 20,000 Americans on a rotational basis. If they want to pull them back, we have to take over. And there is no plan for that. If the United States want to pull back some of its capabilities, heavy lifting that we simply don't have in Europe, there is no plan for the European countries to take over. And that's, I think, what's needed, and that should be the next step after the summit in The Hague.
You mentioned no plan, but is it also that Europe doesn't have, at the moment, the capability, that it simply doesn't have the industrial capacity, doesn't have the weapons systems, doesn't have the, it's in the pipeline, it could happen in 10 or 15 years, but at the moment, there's just massive gaps that the Americans must fill, or else the Europeans just simply can't do that on their own.
No, but the Americans are also struggling. I think in one of the previous panels, Admiral Bauer mentioned that if you order a Patriot missile today, you will get it in, like 10 years' time, which is not acceptable. So the industrial base is struggling in Europe, but also in the United States. And I think there we have to make a switch. Looking at Europe, the defense industrial base in Europe has to grow. It has to become more tech-heavy. I think we also have to realize we have to invest in the new defense capabilities and not in the old defense capabilities. We have to learn from the war in Ukraine, and we have to make choices. And if you plan on the basis of the old plans, yes, then you're going to invest in more tanks. So we also have to have new tanks looking at and prioritize certain capabilities. I think air defense is one obvious capability we have to prioritize. Heavy lifting also, but also intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance would be one priority for me, where you cannot invest, as the Netherlands or Denmark on your own. Doesn't make any sense. So we have to join forces.
Yeah, certainly on the American capacity, manufacturing capacity, I also cover Poland, and you could see that the Poles were trying to buy stuff from the Americans, and the Americans directed them to the South Koreans because they simply couldn't meet that production capability. What's your take on the EU used to be a very marginal player in defense? There's now a lot of talk about large spending instruments, about allowing EU countries to tweak their budget deficit limits to increase defense spending. Is it your sense that Europe is taking appropriate steps when it comes to budgets, to financing, to be able to meet this challenge?
Well, I think that the European Union can and should do two things. So it is create the budgetary instruments and fiscal space to meet the challenge of the increased defense spending of all European countries, but especially, of course, the European countries that are in NATO. And secondary, use the regulatory instruments that the European Union have to create a European defense market, a European internal market for defense capabilities, which doesn't exist. It's very national, and that's one of the problems that we have. But I do think that we should. The European Union and NATO they shouldn't compete. The European Union is not a military organization. NATO is. So you have to find ways in which they can strengthen each other. And I think that this side of the European Union, which is creating a huge market for defense industry, is one of the very strong points. I think the European Commission has taken the right approach to this. And the white paper that's been presented in March on rearming Europe, I think is taking the right approach. And I do hope that they will succeed in doing this in the European way, which is not only the European Union, but include other European countries like the UK, Norway, Turkey, and because we need to see this from the region that Europe is. And of course, It all started, I think, for us with the invasion of Ukraine. So also include Ukraine in all of this.
One final question on America. We're in Copenhagen, the capital of the Kingdom of Denmark. Another part of the Kingdom of Denmark is Greenland. The king has been there. Ministers and prime ministers are in Greenland all the time. There's serious worry about the territorial integrity of Denmark. Donald Trump has talked about potentially, he hasn't ruled out using armed force to take Greenland. That's a fairly astonishing thing to be talking about at a democracy summit in Copenhagen. What do you think about that?
Well, astonishing, as you say. I think it's quite shocking that we're in this situation where they're talking about Greenland, Canada, Panama, and they seem to be serious about this. And I think we are used to a United States that's the leader of the democracies of the world. And that's where we, you know, where we would like to see the United States, and not as a country that is questioning the territorial integrity of other countries. I think the whole basis of our support for Ukraine is the support for the United Nations Charter, for territorial integrity, for sovereignty of countries that cannot be invaded simply by their neighbors just because they are bigger and stronger. And now this is exactly what the President of the United States is alluring to. So I think it's very worrying, and I think we should really unite as European countries behind Denmark, behind Greenland. And from the beginning I've said, you know, if the goal is the minerals, the rare earth minerals in Greenland, well, let's talk about that, not us, but Greenland and the United States. If it's about military presence in Greenland, I don't think that the United States would have to do anything but ask. We've known in the past there have been huge military bases on Greenland. So it's not about that. It's something different. No. And we might be returning to a situation in the world where, you know, might makes right. And that's very worrying. And I think we have to do everything we can to push back on that.
Great, thanks. We do have one question, and this sort of refers to the military buildup. How do we increase the numbers of soldiers? If you look at some of the polling, even frontline countries like Poland, most people would either leave if the country were attacked, or at a minimum would be very reluctant to fight. How do governments, after this very, very long period without war in Europe, motivate and encourage and explain to people why you need to serve in the military? And should governments turn to conscription?
Well, first of all, I wonder if these polls are correct, because it's difficult to imagine for anybody, I think, that your country is actually attacked. And it's even more difficult to imagine what you would do in such a situation. And probably you would do something different than you think now. I think we've seen that in Ukraine. We've seen that in the past in wartime. People do extraordinary things when they're under attack. So my own country, the Netherlands, is also very low on this. But I like to think that in an actual situation of war or invasion, people would think differently. It's the instinct that we have to defend what you have. And secondly, on conscription, yes, we all have different systems. So in the Netherlands, we have the possibility to reactivate conscription, but we haven't done so. Finland still has its conscription, and we know that the Finns are very strong in a military way. They have huge reserves in terms of people that they can call upon. And I think we all are working in the same direction, which is some countries reintroducing conscription, other countries like the Netherlands trying to build up a sort of, in the Swedish way, to call upon young people and those who are interested to offer them the possibility to have a military education and the experience, which is seen very positively. But all because we know we have to increase the numbers, we have to increase the awareness, and we have to increase the number of people that you can call upon at some point if needed. So yes, we have to get those numbers up. And of course, it's different than say 30 years ago. You need different skills also in the new type of warfare and defense and deterrence. And I think we have to focus on that as well. It's not only about the numbers, it's also about what are these people able to do.
You mentioned Ukraine. What's your take on the situation right now. There's Andriy Yermak earlier said that President Zelensky does intend to go to Istanbul. What moment are we in, and are you optimistic or not?
Well, I must say I think that President Zelensky is doing exactly the right thing. And I hope now, with the support of Donald Trump and the US administration, and certainly with the support of the European countries, as we saw last weekend, which was really a strong signal of support. But I think this week is going to be crucial, because we will get the answer from the Russians and from Putin if they're actually willing to engage in serious talks about a ceasefire and at some point sustainable and lasting peace. If they do not accept that you cannot start negotiations until you've actually created the ceasefire situation, then I think that is a sign of ill will, a sign of that there is no interest on the Russian side in stopping this war. And that would also be a very clear signal to the Trump administration that has from the beginning calculated that also the Russians would be willing to do this. Well, if they're not, we're in a different situation. And then everybody knows, including the Americans, that there is no alternative to huge support for Ukraine and huge sanctions and pushbacks on the Russians.
Do you see the danger point of Ukraine getting pushed into a very unfavorable peace deal that will open them to a future Russian attack from this American pressure just to end the fighting, but not necessarily in a way that is sustainable over the long term? Well,
I was more worried about that a couple of months ago, when we saw negotiations going on between the Americans and the Russians with no Ukrainian at the table. I think now, last week, the Vice President of the United States said he wants to see Ukraine and Russia at one table, which is an improvement, because it's recognizing that Ukraine has a say, not only a say in this, they are the most important partner in such a negotiation. And I think it's perfectly clear to everybody now that there are some things that the Russians seem to propose that are unacceptable to Ukraine. Ukraine will never recognize the annexation of its territories. There might be other ways to solve it, but these are annexed territories and they will not recognize it. They will not accept that Putin has a say in whether or not they can apply for NATO membership. They've already applied. It's up to us and up to them. It's not up to Russia. And also, of course, Putin cannot have a say into their political system and the position of President Zelensky. These are all unacceptable and non-negotiable issues. And I think that the partners of Ukraine will support this to the very end. But if all that is agreed on, then there are other issues that they can negotiate on.
The Americans have made clear that at this moment they don't favor Ukraine's entry into NATO. What's your position? Should NATO issue an invitation to Ukraine?
Well, I've been, when I was Minister of Defense, at many NATO meetings where we talked about Ukraine and with Ukraine. And at all these meetings, until last year in the summit in Washington, it was the actual invitation has really, in my opinion, already been issued. It's maybe not written on paper, but it's been promised.
I think the Ukrainians really want that piece of paper.
I know.
The promises are not the same.
They love pieces of paper to make sure that what we say is also true. But you see now where we are. I mean, we've promised them NATO membership. We've said it's not a question of if, but when. And here we are. Of course, we all know that every NATO member has a veto. And we've seen it. We've seen it with Sweden. It took about 18 months for them to join because one or two countries blocked it. So the United States has a veto in this. We all know that. But I think in the end, the security guarantees that Ukraine needs, the strongest security guarantee that you could get is Article 5 of NATO. And I also think it's not only in Ukraine's interest, it's also in our interest. It's in Europe's interest and it's in the United States' best interest to have Ukraine at some point inside NATO. They are, if we were able to get the ceasefire and the peace, they have the strongest and most capable armed force of Europe. And they have combat experience. And so we really should want to have them inside.
You certainly see that in the technology, that they are just way ahead in drones
Incredible.
and a whole bunch of other aspects. Thank you very much for agreeing to take part in the panel. And I'd like to introduce Pierre Collignon. He's the editor-in-chief of Berlingske, who is going to be doing the next